The king's daughters is a term used to refer to the approximately 800 young French women who immigrated to New France between 1663 and 1673 as part of a program sponsored by Louis XIV. The program was designed to boost Canada's population both by encouraging male immigrants to settle there and by promoting marriage, family formation and the birth of children. While women and girls certainly immigrated to New France both before and after this time period, they were not considered to be filles du-roi, as the term refers to women and girls who were actively recruited by the government and whose travel to the colony was paid for by the king. They were also occasionally known as the king's wards, where wards meant those under the guardianship of another. Origins. At its start, New France was a man's world, the province of soldiers, fur trappers, and priests. It had little to offer women. In time, the colony became more agricultural, which allowed for more women, but as late as the mid-17th century, there was a severe imbalance between single men and women in New France. The small number of female immigrants had to pay their own passage, and few single women wanted to leave the familiar places to move and settle in the harsh climate and conditions of New France. The growth of population in the competing English colonies awakened concern among some officials about their ability to maintain their claim in the New World. To increase population and the number of families, the intendant of New France, Jean Talon, proposed that the king sponsor passage of at least 500 women. The king agreed, and eventually nearly twice the number were recruited. They were predominantly between the ages of 12 and 25, and many had to supply a letter of reference from the parish priest before they would be chosen for emigration to New France. Marguerite Bourgeois was the first person to use the expression filles du-roi in her writings. A distinction was made between king's daughters, who were transported to New France at the king's expense and were given a dowry by the king, and women who emigrated voluntarily and using their own money. Other historians used chronological frameworks to determine who could be called a fille du-roi. Research by the historical demographer Yves Landry determines that there were in total about 770 to 850 filles du-roi who settled in New France between 1663 and 1673. The title, King's Daughters, was meant to imply state patronage, not royal or noble parentage. Most of these women were commoners of humble birth. As a fille du-roi, a woman received the king's support in several ways. The king paid 100 livres to the French East India Company for the woman's crossing, as well as furnishing a trousseau. The crown paid a dowry for each woman. This was originally supposed to be 400 livres, but as the treasury could not spare such an expense, many were paid in kind, as was the case for most emigrants who went from France to New France. 80% of the filles du-roi were from the Paris, Normandy and Western regions. The Hôpital Général de Paris and the Saint-Sulpice parish were big contributors of women for the new colony. As such, most of the filles du-roi were from urban areas. A few women came from other European countries, including Germany, England, and Portugal. Those who were chosen to be among the filles du-roi and allowed to emigrate to New France were held to scrupulous standards, which were based on their moral caliber and whether they were physically fit enough to survive the hard work demanded by life as a colonist. The colonial officials sent several of the filles du-roi back to France because they were judged below the standard set out by the king and the intendant of New France. Almost half of the filles du-roi were from the Paris area, 16% from Normandy and 13% from Western France. Many were orphans with very meager personal possessions, and the level of literacy was relatively low. Socially, the young women came from different social backgrounds, but were all very poor. They might have been from an elite family that had lost its fortune, or from a large family with children to spare. Officials usually matched women of higher birth with officers or gentlemen living in the colony, sometimes in the hopes that the nobles would marry the young women and be encouraged to stay in Canada rather than return to France. Integration into new French society. The women disembarked in Quebec City, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal. After their arrival, the time to find husbands varied greatly. For some, it was as short as a few months, while others took 2 or 3 years before finding an appropriate husband. For the process of choosing a husband and the marriage, most couples would officially get engaged in church, with the priest and witnesses present. Then, some couples went in front of the notary to sign a marriage contract. Marriages were celebrated by the priests, usually in the woman's parish of residence, while the marriage banns customarily were to be published 3 times before a wedding could take place. The colony's need for women to marry quickly led to few Filles-du-Roi having marriage bans announced. It is known that 737 of these Filles-du-Roi were married in New France. The marriage contracts represented a protection for the women, both in terms of financial security if anything were to happen to them or the husband, and in terms of having the liberty to annul the promise of marriage if the man they had chosen proved incompatible. A substantial number of the Filles-du-Roi who arrived in New France between 1669 and 1671 cancelled marriage contracts. Perhaps the dowry they had received made them disinclined to retain a fiancé with whom they found themselves dissatisfied. An early problem in recruitment was the women's adjustment to the new agricultural life. As Sainte-Marie de l'Incarnation wrote, the Filles-du-Roi were mostly town girls, and only a few knew how to do manual farm work. This problem remained, but, in later years, more rural girls were recruited. There were approximately 300 recruits who did not marry in New France. Some had changes of heart before embarking from the ports of Normandy and never left. Some died during the journey. Some returned to France to marry, and a few never did marry. Integration in Ville-Marie. Prior to the King's Daughters, the women who immigrated to Ville-Marie, otherwise known as Montreal, had been recruited by the Société Notre-Dame de Montréal, founded in 1641 in Paris. Amongst these women were Jeanne Mance and Marguerite Bourgeois. When the first Filles-du-Roi arrived in Montreal, they were taken in by Bourgeois. Initially, there were no comfortable lodgings to receive them, but in 1668 Bourgeois procured a large farmhouse in which to house them. The Maison Saint-Gabriel. End of recruitment, growth of the settlement. By the end of 1671, Talon suggested that it would not be necessary to sponsor the passage of girls for the next year, and the king accepted his advice. The migration briefly resumed in 1673, when the king sent 60 more girls at the request of Bois de Frontenac, the new governor, but that was the last of the crown's sponsorship. Of the approximately 835 marriages of immigrants in the colony during this period, 774 included Filles-du-Roi. By 1672, the population of New France had risen to 6,700, from 3,200 in 1663. Rumors and legends. The idea that the Filles-du-Roi were prostitutes has been an insidious rumor ever since the inception of the program in the 17th century. It seems to have arisen from a couple of misconceptions, both contemporary and modern, about immigration to French colonies in the New World. The first of these, which took root long before the first Filles-du-Roi emigrated, was that Canada was a penal colony. While there were 2 campaigns in the mid-1600s 16th century that involved the immigration of French criminals to Canada in exchange for the records being expunged. They were both short-lived. These programs resulted in little more than setting a precedent for viewing Canada as a place where those of questionable morality could be sent, for one reason or another. The popularization of the idea that the Filles-du-Roi in particular were prostitutes can be traced to an account by Baron Lahontan of his time in New France. Several earlier sources made the same assertion, including Saint-Amand, Talmud des Arts et Coutumes, and Paul Lejeune. In his account, Lahontan refers to the Filles-du-Roi as being of middling virtue, and wrote that they had emigrated in the hopes of religious absolution. As early as 1738, Claude Lebeau counted his portrayal in an account of his own journey to New France, as did Pierre-François Xavier de Charlevoix in his 1744 work. Out of nearly 800 Filles-du-Roi, only one, Catherine Guichelin, was charged with prostitution while living in Canada. After she was abandoned by her husband, she appeared before the Sovereign Council of New France under the charge of carrying out a scandalous life and prostitution on the 19th of August 1675. Her 2 children were adopted by friends, and she was banished from Quebec City. She was reported to have turned to prostitution after her husband, Nicolas Buteau, abandoned the family and returned to France. She later gave birth to many children out of wedlock. Guichelin had at least 2 marriage contracts cancelled. She also wed twice more after returning to Sorel, Quebec, then Montreal, Quebec. Notable descendants: Saint André Besset, descendant of Filles-du-Roi and Le Seigneur; Hillary Clinton, descendant of Filles-du-Roi; Madeleine Neil and Jean Ducourt-Ledic; Angelina Jolie, descendant of Filles-du-Roi; Denise Collin, Madonna, descendant of Filles-du-Roi and Seigneur; Hall of Fame hockey player Bernie "Boom Boom" Geoffrion was a direct descendant of Marie Priot, a king's daughter. She married Pierre Geoffrion, a farmer and former grenadier from the Carignan Saliers regiment, shortly after her arrival in 1669. Louis Cautleyet, one of the descendants of Catherine Guichelin, became a founding father of Ottawa, Ontario, later Canada's capital. He descended from Marie Vacher, one of Catherine's illegitimate children. He was the first sheriff of Ottawa. Cautleyet's son, Dominique Aimable Cautleyet, served as a member of Parliament in Canada. Tom Bergeron, descendant of Marguerite Bourgeois, as revealed in the August 30, 2015 episode of Who Do You Think You Are?